Teasing. Viaticum. Interrupted Merriment. "Very nice man," Hans Castorp said as they walked out the front door, with a friendly nod to the limping concierge who was sitting in his office sorting letters. The main door was on the southeast side of the large white building, whose middle section rose 1 story higher than the 2 wings, and was crowned by a clock tower roofed with slate-colored sheet iron. Leaving the building by this exit, you did not approach the garden, but came out facing directly onto an open slope of mountain meadows, dotted with a few tallish firs and several low mountain pines that hugged the ground. The path they took, actually it was the only one available other than the main road that descended to the valley, led them gently up the rise to their left, past the rear of the sanatorium where the kitchens and offices were located and steel garbage cans lined the railing beside the cellar stairs, and held to that direction for a good distance, then made a sharp hairpin to the right and began a steeper ascent up the sparsely wooded hill. It was a firm, earthen path, reddish in color and a little damp with boulders here and there along the edge. The cousins quickly learned that they were not alone on their walk. Guests who had finished breakfast shortly after them followed on their heels, and coming toward them were whole groups of people on their way back, stomping the way people tend to walking downhill. "Very nice man," Hans Castorp repeated. "Has such an easy way with words, it's fun to just listen to him. Mercury cigar for thermometer is really quite splendid. I caught on right away. But I'm gonna light a real one now," he said, coming to a halt. "I can't stand it any longer. I've not had a decent smoke since yesterday noon. Excuse me a moment." And from a buff leather etui monogrammed in silver, he extracted one of his Maria Mancinis, a lovely specimen from the top of the box, flattened on just one side, the way he especially liked it, trimmed the tip squarely with a small tool that hung from his watch chain, produced a flame from his pocket lighter, and after a bit of concentrated puffing, managed to light the rather long, blunt-ended cigar. "There," he said. "Now we can get on with our promenade for all I care. Of course, being a zealot, you're not smoking these days, are you?" "I've never smoked," Joachim replied. "Why should I start up here of all places?" "I don't understand," Hans Castorp said. "I don't understand how someone cannot be a smoker. Why, it's like robbing oneself of the best part of life, so to speak. Or at least of an absolutely first-rate pleasure. When I wake up, I look forward to being able to smoke all day, and when I eat, I look forward to it again. In fact, I can honestly say that I actually only eat so that I can smoke, although that's an exaggeration, of course. But a day without tobacco, that would be absolutely insipid, a dull, totally wasted day. And if some morning I had to tell myself there's nothing left to smoke today, why, I don't think I'd find the courage to get up. I swear I'd stay in bed. You see, if a man has a cigar that burns well, and obviously it can't have any breaks or draw badly, that's really terribly annoying. What I'm saying is that if a man has a good cigar, then he's home safe. Nothing, literally nothing, can happen to him. It's the same as when you're lying on the beach. Because there you lie on the beach, you know, and you don't need anything else. No work, no other amusements. Thank God people smoke all over the world. There's nowhere you could possibly end up, as far as I know, where tobacco's unknown. Even polar explorers lay in a good supply of smokes to get them over their hardships. That's always struck a sympathetic chord in me whenever I've read about it. Because things can go very badly. Let's assume, for instance, that things would go miserably for me. But as long as I had my cigar, I'd carry on. That much I know. It could bring me through anything. All the same, it's a sign of a rather weak will, Joachim said, to be so dependent on tobacco. Behrens is quite right. You're a civilian. He meant it in praise, to be sure, but you are an incurable civilian, that's the point. And besides, you're healthy and can do what you like, he said, and a weary look came into his eyes. "Yes, healthy except for anemia," Hans Castorp said. "That was a bit much, though, when he told me that I looked green. But he's right, it's even obvious to me that in comparison to you folks up here, I'm downright green, whereas I never really noticed it at home." And that really was nice of him, to just go ahead and offer some advice, quite sine pecunia, as he put it. I'll be happy to do as he says, and I hereby resolve to adapt my habits to yours. What else can I do as long as I'm up here with all of you? And it can't hurt me, for heaven's sake, to build up my protein, although that does sound disgusting, you must admit. Joachim coughed a couple of times. Climb was taxing for him, it seemed. When he started coughing a third time, he stopped and scowled. Go on ahead, he said. Hans Castor first hurried on without looking back. Then he slowed his pace and came almost to a stop, assuming that by now he had a considerable lead on Joachim, but he did not look back. A party of guests of both sexes was coming toward him. He had noticed them moving along a level stretch of path about halfway up the slope, and now they were tramping downhill, moving directly toward him, and he could hear the babble of voices. There were 6 or 7 people of various ages, from very young things to a few who were somewhat further along in years. Still thinking about Joachim, he tilted his head and looked them over. They were all bareheaded and tanned, the ladies in colorful sweaters, the gentlemen without overcoats for the most part, even without walking sticks. They looked as if they had just stepped out the door for a breath of air, hands in their pockets. Since walking downhill is not a matter of strenuous exertion, but more a sport where you brace your legs and apply the brakes to keep from tripping or running, nothing more than helping yourself fall, really. There was a kind of nimble frivolity to their gait, which spread even to their faces until the whole effect might very well have made you want to join their party. They were just ahead of him now, and Hans Castorp took a close look at their faces. They were not all tanned. 2 of the ladies were conspicuously pale. One thin as a rail, with an ivory complexion. The other shorter and plump, her face blemished by moles and freckles. They all looked at him, all smiling the same cheeky smile. A tall young girl in a green sweater, her hair in untidy disarray and with doltish, half-closed eyes, brushed past Hans Castorp, so close that she almost touched him with her arm. And whistled. No, that was just too crazy. She whistled at him, but not with her mouth. Her lips weren't puckered at all, were tightly closed, in fact. The whistle came from inside, and all the while she stared at him with her doltish, half-closed eyes. An extraordinarily unpleasant whistle. Harsh, intense, and yet somehow hollow. An extended tone, emerging inexplicably from somewhere in her chest and falling off toward the end. It reminded him of the music you get from those inflatable rubber pigs you buy at a carnival, the way they wail mournfully when you squeeze the air out. And then she and the rest of her party had moved on. Hans Castorp stood there aghast, staring straight ahead. Then he quickly turned around and decided that the horrid sound must have been a joke, a prearranged prank. That much at least was clear now, because as they moved on, he saw their shoulders jiggling with laughter, and one stocky lad with thick lips, his hands stuck in his pants pockets, hitching his jacket up in a rather unbecoming way, blatantly turned to look back, and laughed. Joachim had caught up by now. He greeted the party in his usual chivalrous way, bowing and clicking his heels, almost standing at attention, and there was a gentle look in his eye as he joined his cousin. "What sort of face is that you're making?" he asked. "She whistled," Hans Castorp answered. "She whistled from her stomach as she passed me by. Would you kindly explain that to me?" "Oh," Joachim said, laughing dismissively. "Not from her stomach, what nonsense. That was the Kleefeld girl, Hermine Kleefeld, who can whistle with her pneumothorax." "With her what?" Hans Castorp asked. He was terribly agitated, but he didn't quite know in what sense. Wavering between laughter and tears, he added, "You can't expect me to understand your jargon." "Let's move on," Joachim said. "I can just as easily explain it while we walk. You look like you've struck root." As you might guess, it has to do with surgery, an operation that they perform up here. Behrens is quite an expert at it. When one lung has been badly ravaged, you see, but the other is healthy or relatively healthy, the infected one is relieved of its duties for a while, given a rest, which means that they make an incision here, somewhere along the side here. I don't know precisely where they cut. And then they let gas in, nitrogen, you see. And that way the caseated lobes of the lung are put out of commission. The gas doesn't last that long, of course, and has to be replaced twice a month or so. They more or less pump you up. That's how you have to picture it. And after I've done that for a year or so, if all goes well, the lung will have rested long enough to heal. Not always, of course. It's really rather risky business. But they say they've had some nice successes with their pneumothorax. All the people you just saw have had it done. Frau Iltis was one of them, the one with the freckles. And Fräulein Levy, the skinny one, if you recall. She was confined to bed for a long time. They formed a group, something like Pneumothorax brings people together, naturally. And they call themselves the Half-Lung Club. That's the name everyone knows them by. But the pride of the club is Helmina Kleefeld, because she can whistle with her pneumothorax. It's her special talent. It's certainly not something everyone can do. Not that I can tell you how she manages it. She can't clearly explain it herself. But if she's been walking rapidly, then she can whistle from inside, and of course she uses it to startle people, especially newly arrived patients. I presume, by the way, that she's wasting nitrogen by doing it, because she has to get a refill every week. And Hans Kastorp was laughing now. During Joachim's explanation, his agitation had resolved into mirth, and as he walked along, bent forward and shading his eyes with his hand, his shoulders were convulsed by his soft, rapid giggles. "Has the club been registered?" he asked, though he found it hard to speak, and it sounded more like a whine or whimper from suppressed laughter. "Do they have bylaws? What a shame you're not a member, Joachim, because then you can include me as an honorary guest, or associate member. You should ask barons to put you temporarily out of commission. Maybe you'd be able to whistle too, if you really could set your mind to it. After all, it must be something you can learn." "It's the funniest thing I've ever heard in my life," he said, taking a deep breath. "You'll have to forgive me, really, for talking like this, but they were in a merry mood themselves, your pneumatic friends. Here they come walking up. And to think it was the Half-Lung Club. She whistled at me. What a harum-scarum. What absolute devil-may-care. And I'm sure you can tell me just why they're so devil-may-care, can't you?" Joachim searched for an answer. "My God," he said. "They're so free. I mean, they're young, and time plays no role in their lives, and they may very well die. Why should they go around with long faces?" I sometimes think that illness and death aren't really serious matters, that it's all more like loafing around, and that, strictly speaking, things are serious only down below in real life. I think maybe you'll come to understand that in due time, after you've been up here with us a little longer. "Certainly," Hans Kastorp said. "I'm certain I shall. I'm already taking a great deal of interest in all of you up here. And once one is interested, why then, understanding follows as a matter of course, doesn't it? But what's wrong with me? This doesn't taste good," he said, looking at his cigar. "I've been asking myself the whole time what was the matter, and now I realize that my Maria is the problem. I swear you it tastes like papier-mâché, exactly as if I had a terribly upset stomach. It's really quite incredible. I did eat an unusually large breakfast, but that can't be the reason, because when you eat a lot, it always tastes especially good at first. Do you think it's because I slept so restlessly? Perhaps that's thrown me off track. No, I'm simply going to have to toss it away," he said after trying once more. "Every puff is a disappointment. There's no point in forcing it." He hesitated for a moment, and then flicked the cigar down the slope among the wet pines. "Do you know what I'm convinced is to blame?" he said. "I am thoroughly convinced that it has something to do with this damned flushed face of mine. It's been bothering me again, ever since I got up. Damned if it doesn't feel like I'm constantly blushing in embarrassment. Was it the same with you, too, when you first arrived?" "Yes," Joachim said. "I felt rather strange, too, at first." "Don't worry about it. I told you, if you remember, that it's not all that easy to get used to our life up here. But you'll soon be back on track. Look there, that bench has a nice view. Let's sit down for a bit and then head home. I need to take my rest cure." They were now about a third of the way up the hill, but the path had leveled out, heading now in the direction of Davosplatz. From between the tall firs and a few stunted ones bent by the wind, the view looked down on the village, which lay white under a brighter sky. The rudely fashioned bench on which they sat had its back to the steep slope. Water fell in an open wooden trough beside them, gurgling and splashing on its way to the valley. Pointing with the tip of his Alpenstock, Joachim said about teaching his cousin the names of the cloud-topped peaks that appeared to close off the valley to the south. But Hans Castorp was bent forward, glancing up only fleetingly while drawing figures in the sand with the silver-trimmed knob of his citified cane. And now he demanded to know other things. "What I wanted to ask you," he began. "The case in my room expired just before I arrived, you said. Have there been a lot of other deaths since you've been up here?" "Several, certainly," Joachim replied. "But they deal with them discreetly, you see, so you don't hear about them, or only occasionally later on. When someone dies, it's kept a strict secret, out of consideration for the other patients, in particular the ladies, who might easily go to pieces. If someone dies right next door, you don't even notice it. The coffin is brought in early in the morning while you're still sleeping, and then the party in question is removed only at another more suitable time, during meals, for instance." Hans Castorp said, and went on drawing. "So that quite a bit is happening backstage." "Yes, you can put it that way. But recently, it must have been, wait a moment, probably 8 weeks ago." "Then you can't call it recently," an alert Hans Castorp remarked dryly. "What?" "Well, then not so recently. You're so precise. I was just guessing at the date. But anyway, some time ago, I had a peek backstage myself, purely by accident. But it's as real as if it had happened today. It was a little Huyus girl, Barbara Huyus. She was Catholic. When they brought her to the Viaticum, sacrament for the dying, you know, extreme unction, she was still up and about when I arrived here and could be so playfully funny. So downright silly. A real teenager. But then it all went very fast. She couldn't get up anymore. Lay bedridden just 3 rooms down from me. And her parents came, and so now the priest arrived too. He came one afternoon when everyone was at tea, with nobody in the halls. But you have to picture it. I had overslept, had fallen asleep during my rest cure and hadn't heard the gong, and was a quarter hour late. And so at the decisive moment, I happened not to be where everyone else was, but had wandered backstage, as you put it. And as I'm walking down the corridor, I see them coming toward me in lace shirts, a cross leading the way, a gold cross with little lanterns, one of them carrying it up front like a glockenspiel in a Turkish-style military band." "That's a poor comparison," Hans Castorp said rather sternly. "It just seemed that way to me. It automatically reminded me of it. But now listen, they're coming toward me. Left, right, left, double time, 3 of them, if I'm not mistaken. The man with the cross first, then the priest, spectacles perched on his nose, then a boy with a censer. The priest was carrying the sacrament against his chest. It had a cover over it, and holding his head very devoutly to one side. It's their Holy of Holies, after all." "That's precisely it," Hans Castorp said. "That's the reason why I was astounded when you said what you did about the glockenspiel." Yes, but just wait. If you had been there, you wouldn't know what kind of face to put on either, thinking back on it. It was like something you might see in a dream." "In what way?" "Let me tell you. So, there I am, asking myself how I ought to act under the circumstances. I didn't have a hat to take off. You see," Hans Castorp quickly interrupted yet again, "you see, a man should always wear a hat. I've noticed, of course, that you people up here never wear one, but you should so that you can tip it whenever the occasion demands. But now what happened?" "I stood back against the wall," Joachim said, taking up a respectful pose, and made a little bow as they came even with me. It was right in front of the little Huyus girl's room, number 28. The priest was glad to see my response, I think, and returned my greeting very politely, doffing his cap. But by this time they have all come to a halt, and the altar boy with the censer knocks on the door, then lifts the latch, and lets his supervisor step ahead into the room. But now, just picture it, just imagine the terror I felt. The moment the priest sets a foot over the threshold, a hue and cry starts up inside. First a shriek like nothing you've ever heard, 3 or 4 times in a row, and then just screaming, without a pause or break, like a mouth gaping wide open, I suppose. Ah! With such misery and terror and defiance in it, that I can't describe it, and such ghastly pleading mixed in too. And then all of a sudden it turns hollow and muffled, as if it has sunk down into the earth, or is coming from a deep cellar. Hans Castorp had turned abruptly to face his cousin. "And was that the Huyus girl?" he asked in exasperation. "But why from a deep cellar?" "She had crawled under the blanket," Joachim said. "Just imagine how I felt. The priest was standing just on the far side of the threshold, speaking soothing words. I can still see him, the way he constantly thrust his head forward and then jerked it back. The crossbearer and the altar boy were stuck there at the door and couldn't get in. But I could see between them into the room. It's a room just like yours or mine, with the bed to the left of the door along one side, and there were people standing at its head. Her family, of course, her parents, directing comforting words down at the bed, where you can only see a formless mass, begging and protesting hideously and kicking its legs." "Are you saying she was kicking with her legs?" "For all she was worth. But it didn't help. She had to be given the sacrament of the dying." The pastor walked over to her, and the other two stepped inside as well, and then the door was closed. But just before that, I saw the Huyus girl's head emerge for a mere second, her light blonde hair, and her pale eyes, no color to them at all, gaping wide, staring at the priest. And then she ducked under the sheets again with a loud wail. "And you're telling me only now?" Hans Castorp said after a pause. "I can't understand how you didn't bring it up yesterday evening. But my God, she must have had a lot of strength left to fight back like that. That takes strength. You shouldn't send for a priest until they're very weak." "But she was weak," Joachim said. "Oh, there are lots of things I could tell you about. It's hard to know just what to pick out first. She was already weak. It was fear that gave her so much strength. She was terribly frightened because she realized she was going to die. She was just a young girl, so it's excusable after all. But even grown men carry on like that sometimes, which is, of course, inexcusably weak-willed of them. Behrens knows how to deal with them. He can strike just the right tone for such cases." "What sort of tone?" Hans Castorp asked with a scowl. "Don't make such a fuss," he says, Joachim replied. "That's at least what he said to one fellow recently. We heard about it from the head nurse, who was present to help restrain the dying man. He was one of those types who makes a dreadful scene right at the end and absolutely refuses to die. So Behrens simply dressed him down. 'Would you please not make such a fuss?' he said. And the patient quieted down at once and died peaceably." Hans Castorp slapped his thigh with one hand, threw himself back against the bench, and stared at the sky. "Listen here, that's weighty stuff," he cried. "Snaps his head off and says, 'Don't make such a fuss?' To a dying man? Weighty stuff. A dying man deserves a certain amount of respect. You can't just walk up to him so calm and cool, and there's something holy about a dying man, as it were, in my opinion." "I won't deny that," Joachim said. "But if he starts carrying on in such a weak-willed way—" "No!" Hans Castorp insisted with a ferocity not at all appropriate to the mild objection Joachim had offered. "I'll not let you talk me out of it. A dying man has something nobler about him than your average rascal strolling about, laughing and making money and stuffing his belly. It won't do." And his voice began to waver strangely. "It just won't do to walk up so calm and cool and—" But now his words were swallowed in a fit of laughter that suddenly overwhelmed him, the same laughter as yesterday, welling up from deep inside, convulsive, unbounded laughter, until he had to close his eyes for the tears. "Psst," Joachim said suddenly. "Quiet," he whispered, and gave his cousin, still laughing uncontrollably, a silent poke in the ribs. Hans Castorp looked up through his tears. A stranger was coming up the path on their left. A delicate man with brown hair and a black mustache twirled at the ends. He was wearing pastel-checked trousers and exchanged a good morning with Joachim as he came up to them. His greeting was precise and melodious. And now he stopped, striking a graceful pose in front of them by propping himself on his cane and crossing his ankles.